Mas então, só dar boas-vindas a todos, boa tarde, super obrigado pela presença. A gente dá hoje início às atividades de programas públicos do 19º Festival de Arte Contemporânea Sesc Vídeo Brasil, com a quarta e última mesa do seminário Lugares e Sentidos da Arte, debates a partir do Sul. Passar a palavra para a Sabrina Moura, que vai fazer a introdução da mesa, e, ao final, eu dou uns recados para falar um pouco da programação do festival, que se estende ainda até o dia 6 de dezembro. Se vocês que estiverem na ponta, tiver muito ruim de enxergar o mapa e quiserem sentar mais para cá para ficar mais confortável. Não, tem.
Bom, boa tarde. Obrigada pela presença aqui hoje. Então, é a nossa última mesa do seminário. Ele aconteceu durante todo o mês de outubro e começou durante a semana de abertura do festival, no dia 4, depois a gente teve um no dia 7, no dia 22 e agora o último. E, durante esses encontros, nós debatemos temas bem amplos, né? Então, a ideia de narrativa, a noção de contemporaneidade, a noção de tempo, enfim, questões amplas, mas que serviram para a gente criar uma espécie de base onde questões mais específicas pudessem emergir. E o porquê disso? Porque a gente entende que o festival é um lugar onde uma diversidade muito grande de trabalho se apresenta. Então, ao invés de restringir esses temas, a gente tentou elaborar uma plataforma onde eles pudessem emergir ao longo das conversas. E não tentar criar espécies de caixinhas a priori, né, para que eles pudessem se encaixar. E, bom, acho que o nome do festival ele dá uma chave importante de leitura para as nossas conversas, que é Lugares e Sentidos da Arte, debates a partir do Sul. E essa ideia que eu acabei repetindo na introdução dos outros encontros, mas eu gostaria de falar mais uma vez também para os nossos convidados, retomando, inclusive, uma fala do próprio Gerardo Mosquera, que é essa ideia de pensar o Sul como um lugar de fala, e não como um território geográfico pré-definido, né? E que, portanto, teria, em teoria, algumas características essenciais que seriam do Sul, né? Então, a gente privilegiou pensar o pensamento a partir do Sul. E, no último encontro, foi muito interessante, porque a gente discutiu a noção de narrativas a partir de uma perspectiva ficcional, né? Então, como que a ficção e a arte, os artistas, liberam a nossa estrutura narrativa para que ela possa ser concebida de uma outra maneira, né? Como que a ficção também trata da realidade e como uma discussão ou uma representação muitas vezes documental acaba distorcendo aquilo que a gente entende por real, seja lá o que isso queira dizer, né? E hoje a gente volta um pouco para esse tema pensando a partir da história, né? Então, do fazer histórico, e como que a arte ela oferece outros dispositivos ou metodologias ou leituras para a narrativa histórica. Então, a gente trouxe participantes aqui hoje que trabalham de formas muito diferentes com a ideia, com o arquivo, com a própria história, ou com a noção de silêncio, como o silêncio ele acaba se expressando de outras formas, né? E eu acho que a partir de perspectivas disciplinares também muito distintas. Então, a gente tem o Gerardo Mosquera, que é curador, foi uma figura muito importante na fundação da Bienal de Havana, na história da Bienal de Havana, nos anos 80. Depois ele, enfim, entrou num percurso independente, com uma série de projetos curatoriais, trabalhou no New Museum em Nova York, e hoje ele veio diretamente da Trienal Poligráfica de San Juan, de Porto Rico, para falar com a gente. Muito obrigada pela sua presença de tão longe. A gente tem o Ntone Edjabe, que não chegou ainda, ele veio da África do Sul, e tem um projeto muito interessante, ele é DJ, jornalista, e ele fundou uma revista que se chama Chimurenga, e que trabalha com leituras diversas do panafricanismo, tanto dentro do continente africano, quanto pela diáspora. E ele, além da revista, criou uma espécie de arquivo, ou uma biblioteca, que reúne uma série de publicações que tratam desse tema e publicou isso online, né? Então, é, de uma certa forma, um arquivo online que ilumina aspectos dos festivais culturais pan-africanos na década de 60 e 70 e que tinham sido pouco revisitados, enfim, tanto por práticas arquivísticas quanto artísticas. E o Karol, tão difícil falar esse sobrenome, Radziszewski, alguma coisa assim, que vai falar sobre as políticas do arquivo queer na Polônia e na Europa do Leste, e também sobre uma pesquisa que ele tem tanto como artista quanto como editor e curador. E antes da gente começar a nossa conversa, eu queria partir de 2 trabalhos que foram exibidos no festival, que são os trabalhos do Dorgues e do Christian Lenhard, e a gente vai começar com uma entrevista desses artistas que vão apresentar alguns temas transversais que vão guiar o nosso debate.
Bom, eu moro no Recife. E no Recife... Mas eu sou do interior do Rio Grande do Sul. Então Mas eu fui criado vendo TV Globo, que era a única coisa que pegava no interior que eu morava. Quando eu ia para casa da minha avó, na cidade, pegava TV Cultura. Eu ficava ali vidrado vendo TV Cultura. Então era uma mistura de mato, porque era um interior mato, no meio do mato, com TV. Uma coisa meio assim de contato com as imagens. Era o mato e aquele nada dentro do mato e a sensação de que tinha bicho e que os bichos poderiam estar perto e tinham medo, mas ao mesmo tempo uma solidão porque nenhum bicho chegava perto. E aí o mundo de uma fantasia que era o mundo que se via nos filmes, nas séries de TV, nessas coisas, porque era uma infância também um pouco solitária. Então eu sinto um pouco essa relação assim dessa formação, sabe, no mundo de quando é criança, assim. E aí então há tipo assim um sonho de estar nesse outro mundo que é do outro lado de lá da tela. E aí, enfim, eu acho que, e aí, enfim, hoje eu moro no Recife e o Recife, o estado de Pernambuco, ele ainda mantém uma série de manifestações folclóricas muito parecidas de como elas eram há algumas décadas atrás, quando o Brasil era exatamente aquilo. O Brasil já foi um país rural, onde a imagem dele era rural. E depois, com o tempo, ele foi em busca de uma modernização e essa imagem dele e os valores que se tinha foi também se transformando. E aí esse lugar, o Recife, ele parece que é uma mistura bem mistura dessas duas coisas. uma coisa de um avanço, de uma modernidade e um ruralismo, assim, sabe? Uma coisa rural, uma coisa que eu chamo assim de jegue, sabe? Quando tu tenta ser, mas tu é jegue, mas dá tudo errado. Mas esse errado é muito legal, sabe? O errado que fica bonito, que é uma característica meio brasileira, assim, que eu também vejo. Que é meio difícil dizer brasileiro, porque são tantas regiões e aspectos diferentes que tem esse país, desde o sul, centro e bem no norte, que eu acho meio difícil dizer. Só que como eu nasci no sul e moro no nordeste, às vezes eu acho que é tudo meio igual, assim, sabe? Acho que as músicas que eu via num baile, que eu ia com meu pai, com a minha mãe, música de bandinha, que provavelmente tinha uma influência dos alemães, é muito parecido com o que de repente tem lá numa música brega do Recife, sabe? Que quando as pessoas acham que é diferente, mas para mim é muito parecido.
Bypass is actually, it's true that it's different from the CPA, from the Christian Palestinian Archive, but it's very similar in the sense that this work also tells a story of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. The work that I'm showing now in the current festival is a work that it's a combine of 36 slide, how do you say it? Slides? I will say it again. 36 slides that in first glance it looks like animals just walk through the field and have and created this kind of roots in the fields, that it's very natural. But if you know the political context, then you find out that actually this is routes that were made by Palestinian workers crossing from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem around the wall, the separation wall. So it looks very simple, but actually it's very politically charged work. I'm documenting the path without the human present and from a perspective of someone that is actually walking in these lines, in these roads. I think that the pace of the slides are very similar to the pace of walking. It's kind of echoing this action of walking from one step to another. Well, I think that memory and to forget and to remember are kind of similar. I guess it's the same. It's different sides of the same coin, in a sense that when you forget something or when you remember something, you forget something else because you put light into it, and the opposite. And I think that my role as an artist is sometimes to just shed light on narratives that are not easy to remember, not easy to be mentioned in any kind of official public platforms. So in a way, it's raising those narratives and raising questions about the narratives that we do remember. Obviously, my origin is both. It's 100% Israeli, 100% Jewish, 100% Palestinian, 100% Christian. I've come from kind of what people refer to as a junction in terms of politics. So I think that obviously this is a significant info about me as an artist, as a creative person, because it shaped the way that I'm looking at reality, the way that I experience the Israeli occupation. I think that identity is something that is very fluent, and it changes, and it depends on the context. And I think that it's an ongoing struggle to find or to shape your identity, and also a very exciting process.
Antes de passar a palavra para o Karol, eu queria só falar que o trabalho do Dó, o Bypass, ele está aqui na exposição, no Sesc Pompeia, no espaço da convivência, e o trabalho do Cristiano está no Galpão VB, na Vila Leopoldina.
So it's gonna be. Hello, my name is Karol Radziszewski, and I'm a visual artist from Poland. But I want to briefly show you two of my projects, which are dealing with the archive and memory. The title of the whole presentation is "The Politics of Queer Archives," because this is what I'm recently working on, and since 2005, I become interested. I mean, 2005 it was a very special moment in Poland regarding the politics, very conservative moment, and actually we had the elections 3 days ago, so it's now coming back, the same super conservative government. So when I will get back from Brazil, I will experience again these feelings. But I should be kind of thankful for them, because in 2005 the pressure of the conservatism pushed me to make the first openly gay exhibition in my country, and also to start a magazine called DIK Fagazine. So you see here a few issues. I'm still running this publication. It's irregular. It's published Polish and English, or sometimes just English. Sometimes it's more monographic, like dedicated to some countries like Ukraine or Romania. Sometimes it's about different topics, but everything is related to the idea of masculinity and homosexuality in Central and Eastern Europe. And so the magazine became part of my artistic activity, and especially the issue that I prepared called Before 89, it was the summarizing 3 years of my traveling to different Eastern European countries, post-Soviet countries, like Estonia, Romania, Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and so on. And in this issue, I was trying to combine all the research dedicated to the gay life before the communists fall down. So cruising areas, bars, first publications, different aspects of the queer life were described from the perspective of different countries from the region. And one of the issues, like the latest issue I just passed by, so Teresa, if you can show, so if you want to take a look, it's just the recent one is dedicated to Czechoslovakia. At the beginning, the magazine was more dedicated to what's happening now in Poland, because it was this kind of magazine, but later on it became more focused on archives and history. While I was working on this particular issue Before 89, this is another example of how I work. So this is the research made for the issue that's supposed to be about Serbia, but it never come out, the issue, but the work is sometimes, the magazine is a base, but sometimes it takes forms of installation or audio recordings, like an open archive that it's growing, and it's presented in a different ways on the different exhibitions. But when I was selecting material for this Before 89 issue, I met Ryszard Kisiel, the guy on the left, photographed in his bathroom. And he was running the publication called Philo, the first gay publication in that region, Central Eastern Europe. Here you can see some mock-ups of this publication. And it was in 1985-86 when he started, because it was the really intense political situation in Poland at the time. We have the Operation Hyacinth, the action organized by the Secret Service Police against the homosexuals in Poland. They were collecting data called pink files. They collect 11,000 of files of the gay people to blackmail them and to make them to work for the Secret Service Police, or to just make them scared of what they are doing. But Ryszard Kisiel, he was interesting person also because he was working in a printing house, but this is what you see, Polish Gay Guide on this European socialist countries. It's not a really book, it's just, he printed the first cover, but it's a notebook from his different trips to several countries of Eastern Europe, like Bulgaria or Czechoslovakia. So the archive is really big. I want to show you some stuff and then I will discuss with more details, but When I mentioned this Operation Hyacinth, everybody were freaking out, they were really afraid, but Richard Kisiel, he was the one who said that if already police make me coming out, I can do whatever I want now. So he started to publish this magazine, mostly with the informations about AIDS crisis that had just started, but also with the group of friends at private flat, they started to do some photo shoots. When I met him first time, we talked only about his magazine, but then one day when I was visiting him, he's living in Gdańsk, north part of Poland, it's a harbor, and when I visited him, he said, oh, you know, I have something like this, maybe you'll be interested. And there was a bag under his bed full of the colorful slides in the boxes, like more than 300 color slides, documenting different, like a private sessions they organize with friends, dressing up. And I found these pictures and this photographs is called, the title is Be Careful AIDS, and he's wearing like an Indian shaman dress to somehow make a magic against the AIDS crisis. I mean, they were very self-ironic in these photographs, and they were not artists. So when I found this archive, it's something like I discovered the lack, because in the Polish culture there's almost no images like that in art or culture general. So this private archive is kind of proof that those kind of things were existing, and most of my work I'm calling kind of searching for ancestors, because to find the roots for my art and for my identity, it was pretty hard, and I decided to make it by myself. So this is another example of slides, which is, we'd say, we want porn, not ORM. ORM was the Secret Service police. Celebrate homo, get away Zomo. Zomo was also kind of a police. And so these photographs were really, they're really erotic, joyful, and even in, I spoke with some people here already in Brazil that I had this feeling that it's a bit different and similar in a different ways, but we can talk about it later, that the body in Polish art, in culture, it's always used as a tool. It's never for joyful, it's never real body, it's always body covered with art. So with these photographs, somehow it's changing. And then I started to work on the Richard Kisiel archive. The whole project is called Kisieland. And this is a frame from the film, half-an-hour documentary I made, kind of reenactment of his activities. I invited him to my studio so he could work with the model, and somehow, even it wasn't intended, he was referring to his drawings and ideas from the photo shoots he organized with friends in the 80s. And and the whole project is called Kisieland because I found it quite interesting that this one man say something totally different, react opposite to this kind of communist terror, and create his own world, like Disneyland in communist Poland. And all his archives and activities are kind of unique and very special. That's why the whole project is called Kisieland, and it's still running since 2009. It's like an ongoing project of mine. Maybe I'm a bit chaotic, but later you can ask all the questions and I will explain you the details. Just briefly want to introduce you to the whole film thing. And this is one of the examples how I work with his archive. This is Love by Robert Indiana, transformed by from the 60s, transformed by General Idea in 1987. I don't know if you're familiar with this work, but it's an iconic work dedicated to the AIDS crisis. And what I was interested in, that in Poland there is almost no any artwork related to that issue. But at that time, in the Philo, the publication run by Richard Kisiel, I found this collage with the simple stickers with Donald Duck. It's not from the chewing gum, but rather like a cheap alphabet stickers that we have from the West, like a kind of copy of the West. And this collage, it's written like, be careful, play safe, and the AIDS, it's made with these stickers. I asked him why that time when the AIDS crisis just started there, how come they made this collage, and he said like, oh, you know, the tension was so big, everybody were terrifying, so we wanted to, I don't know if it's a proper word, cheer them up, but somehow make it more positive, the whole situation. And I found that this gesture of the amateur, not an artist, very similar to what General Idea actually did. And what I'm very interested in, how the original intention from the Eastern European archive remixed with the iconic images from the Western culture are, when it's mixed, then the new work can be born. And that's how I compare a general idea work. I transform the collage in the square and then create a series of works like posters and paintings, wallpapers, graphics related to those two sources. So you can see them here. On one of the exhibitions, because the project is presented in many different ways, I managed to have the original piece of the general idea wallpaper combined with my wallpaper and the paintings on this. And this is just one of the, and sometimes on the shows I'm showing the original photographs from Ryszard Kisiel archive, the film, and objects that I create based on his publication. And this is the image from the Performa Bienal, the performance biennial in New York, where I was invited to one of the few Polish artists who were, how many times we have? Okay. I will show you these images and then briefly talk about it, but this is, it was interesting for me on many levels because the biennial wanted to have national representation of Norway and Poland, and I was one of the few Polish artists who was representing country. This is also my strategy to use art in a political way and subversive way. So I proposed to bring Ryszard Kisiel to New York. The posters you saw with the Donald Duck was also on the streets of New York, and I arranged kind of the performative night event with inviting the activists of Grand Fury and ACT UP from New York and Ryszard Kisiel to kind of for the first time confront the narration around the beginning of the AIDS crisis in New York and Eastern Europe. And also we were reading some publications like the book called Serbian Diaries. It was the diary of one of the Serbian writers who described in the 80s his adventures, but also the beginning of the AIDS crisis. All of those were with the scenography that, I don't have these images now with me, but this Donald Duck was present there also as a kind of statement, and the film was presented. But for me, it was interesting that the Polish government had to pay for his trip and my presentation as a kind of national representation, because it showed how much it's changed for the decade when I was doing the first show. And also, but now it's gonna change again. So, what I'm trying to say that to work with the queer archives, because the issue that's circulating now that you can see about Czechoslovakia, it's dedicated to even I'm going even more deeper into the past, in the 40s, 30s, because the first magazine in Czechoslovakia was published in 1931. So for me, it's a question why we have to refer to the, I don't know, British gay zines from the 60s, where we have such a tradition in our region. Because with all these archives, when I'm traveling to Eastern Europe and exploring Polish archives the most, what I'm trying to do is kind of build a parallel narration about not only queer life, but general kind of local story with different words, different symbols. And it's pretty hard because it's going against what the young LGBTQ activists wants, the kind of talk about pink money, the law, and building positive image of the gay and lesbian society in the community in the society. So what I'm doing, it's not really the perfect for them, referring to cruising areas or sex, sexual life, and so on. But for me, it's important to kind of, as I said, searching for the queer ancestors and build it again as a new narration. It's also interesting for me because Poland, when the communists fell down in 1981, we had to rebuild our kind of sense of nation again. So the history was manipulated and still is a lot, rewritten. And the same with the arts. We are bringing the artists from the neo-avant-garde times, from 60s, 70s, writing new books, and everything is shaking in a way. But nobody really is interested in this queer topic. And it's always kind of very marginalized. So, instead of kind of going to the streets and protest, which I was doing in the like 10 years ago, I found it quite interesting to work with the archives and presenting this in the form of the magazine, artworks, and conferences and lectures to kind of subvert the Polish culture and to make that in the future some of those stuff will be in the books, Polish books of culture and history, as a subversive kind of activity, political activity, but also my kind of new activism, let's say. And also, most of the friends I have, when they are working on the similar issues in different countries of Eastern Europe, they work very much on the national kind of heritage, culture. It's also because of the language. But my goal is to somehow extend it to cover the whole region. And what I found very interesting now, coming to Sao Paulo and being a part of the residency of Video Brazil, it's to compare this crucial East-West relation to South-North and how much it's related, how much not. I also posed the question if Poland is South or not, which will be interesting for me to discuss too. And yeah, I think it's generally what I wanted to say about to get you the idea how and what about is my work, but I will be happy to answer all the questions and to explore this topic also in the conversation. Thank you.
We are going to hear everyone's presentations and then we will open to questions. But thank you very much, Karol. Ntone, I have already introduced you, so you can start your presentation.
Hello there. My name is Ntone Edjabe. I'm a writer and a journalist based in Cape Town in South Africa. And I want to talk about a newspaper. Essentially, I want to talk about time. I know it's a little ironic, but in 2008, for about 3 weeks, South Africa, where I lived, we experienced a xenophobic attack, you know, a crisis which involved violence against migrants from other African countries. And this lasted for about 3 weeks. This is not particularly unusual in South Africa. I mean, South Africa is a new country, so there are quite a few disputes, some more violent than others, around selfhood, citizenship. All of those questions are still up in the air. And we've had these attacks periodically since the early 90s, but this was the most violent, you know. Over 100 people died, thousands were displaced, and so forth. So this was in May 2008. But about 7 years before that, I'd founded a literary journal. I mean, sometimes it's confusing. The simplest way to describe it is to call it a literary journal. It's a much more complicated thing than that. And hopefully, if I get to show you some images, you see. So this journal, or let's call it a platform, a kind of discursive platform, a reflective platform, we called it Chimurenga. Chimurenga means struggle, or more precisely, the spirit of struggle. That too is a little ironic because South Africa is coming out of a long struggle, which took a few hundred years. And we are all celebrating the new democracy and the multiracial society that Mandela has invented for us. And here we come out with a journal called Struggle, to suggest that the struggle for freedom wasn't necessarily limited to the right to vote, you know, one man, one vote type slogan. We published this magazine for, like I said, 7 years, and by most accounts that I received, it's a very small initiative, was relatively successful. I mean, as successful as a literary magazine can be, I mean, usually literary magazines, if you can get all your friends and family to read it, that's already success. It's usually very small worlds, It's usually about inventing worlds, But after these attacks happened, I became, let me just backtrack a little bit. I mean, the process of starting a literary magazine in South Africa in 2002 is a process of continuity, really. And I think that's why the publication was called Chimurenga in the first place. This is the kind of stuff that we've done during the struggle, but, literature, culture, arts production, knowledge production as spaces and sites of resistance. I'm sure you all are very familiar with this. I believe there was some fairly oppressive dictatorship here too. So these are modes of resistance. There's nothing fundamentally new about that. And we become quite comfortable in these modes because we understand them. We know how to publicize them, how to circulate them. In fact, the worlds that they are meant to create are not fundamentally new. They are also in continuity of what has happened previously. But when you do that, because you're so excited, you're not necessarily reflexive about this. You say you are doing something fundamentally different, but you're not, because you are continuing form, you are continuing language, you are even continuing the performance of that production. But we didn't know this. We were just way too excited. Until this attack in 2008, and then the question of relevance that we'd been fighting. Sorry, I have to backtrack again. The question of relevance is very important. Relevance is what defines the production of culture in the places I've lived. Relevance is crucial. When you write, you must also know why you write. Nobody just fucking writes. Like, why do you write? And what do you want to change about the world? So this is a sine qua non condition of production of culture in the way that I was trained and in the way that I've worked as a writer and as a journalist. So Chimurenga was this kind of attempt to fight against relevance. Just we write because we are alive, not because we want to feed more children or build a hospital, So that was the first gesture. So back to 2008 again. Can you hear me? I just realized I was speaking off mic. Yeah, so in 2008 this attack happened, and I become aware, my colleagues become aware that all we've been doing with all our enthusiasm and our imagination is sort of, it's difficult to evaluate, but to put it mildly, we felt kind of defeated, right? A lot of what came up to questions of citizenship, nationhood, new assertiveness politically, intellectually, artistically, is what we've been writing about for 8 years. So when this shit happens, you're like, but this is what we've been writing about for 8 years. So there's a strong feeling, or at least for me at the time, it was a strong feeling of impotence, or certainly the limits of this kind of very self-conscious writing we've been producing. We really felt like we were doing some kind of struggle, like the name of the publication. And so it took us a while to recover from that. I don't think I ever recovered, but as a result of this, I thought we should change form, we should change format, we should change language. I thought the literary magazine in the context I live in and I work in is what's irrelevant. It's not what we've been writing about. It's the form, the format, the language, the production, which is contained into this kind of event cycle where you come up with a brilliant idea, you perform the brilliant idea, you get congratulated for the brilliant idea, you congratulate yourself for the brilliant idea, you have a few beers, and then you start again. So this kind of biennale type production of arts where, you know, particularly in Africa, the production of knowledge and the production of culture becomes tied to this kind of cycles, you know, because every brilliant idea comes with its funding, you know, and with its kind of capital accumulation. And by that, I don't necessarily only mean financial, I also mean in terms of energy, resource. I mean, this shit, no one gets paid for it, so people spend so much energy to publish or to realize something like that, that you can't do it every day. You have to accumulate energy, make new friends, convince these friends to write for free, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm sure you're familiar with all of this. Anyway, this is the cycle, or one of the things that made me aware that the work we've been producing was irrelevant. Not the writing itself, but the way in which we've been producing the writing. The chronic, then, is what we call this newspaper. So we decided to move away from this form of the magazine, which has been established since the early 20th century, into a newspaper. And we actually called it a newspaper. Again, I may be able to show you some images later. How much time do I have? Okay. I'm going to skip a few steps. It's a very long story. But because of all the considerations I've already outlined, we thought we will not just produce a newspaper, because what that crisis, that social crisis of 2008 demonstrated to me personally was that we were also caught in a crisis of language, a crisis of articulation, which is what I'm trying to explicate. So we decided, why don't we go back, you know, a few years later. This is now in 2011. We've tried to continue to produce this magazine, but it's not working. We kind of stuck. And myself and my colleagues decided, why don't we go back to 2008? In fact, because this is where our problems begin. This is when we became confused. So let's create a time travel machine. Are you familiar with a time travel? Yeah, sorry. Yes, of course. Let's create a time travel machine. Let's create a newspaper as a machine that allows us to travel back in time, but not travel back in time in order to kind of revisit or re-experience the events of May 2008, or even to necessarily just ask the question, what could have been done? There's something very frustrating about hindsight, right? I think hindsight is the most useless thing, because what is the fucking point of knowing what you should have done, right? You can no longer do it. You may use it in a different circumstance, but the very circumstance that you've produced knowledge about, that knowledge is useless. And the point of traveling back was to use the knowledge we've gained from the crisis itself and use it in the crisis of language, yeah, that we were ourselves caught into. So in essential, because the language, I have to apologize, I use this term language, crisis, and so forth. I hope in the discussion we speak more in detail about that. But one quick remark about language is that when I talk about the crisis of language, I talk about I'm not sure if incapacity, but certainly a difficulty in speaking about ourselves and speaking from ourselves. Yeah. So there's a Cameroonian philosopher, Ashim Bembu, calls it African modes of self-writing. This kind of conceptual space where the language that we produce about our life, our practice of life, is so behind the practice that the language is meant to articulate. We are constantly caught in this kind of jet lag. I mean, we ourselves are caught in this jet lag, but I'm not even going to talk about the foreign correspondent who lands in Africa from Le Monde or the New York Times and has to report on this crisis. I mean, he's double caught in the jet lag. But the jet lag does not only concern nationality, as in who has experience, as in lived experience in the crisis. The jet lag is more conceptual than that, because we are ourselves caught into it. The continent, the countries and the cities that we write about have fuck all to do with the place we live and the way we live in these places. And so this gesture, this time travel machine was meant to allow us to finally be able to use hindsight to travel back into the social crisis, yeah, in order to speak about the crisis, in order to address the crisis of language. Okay, time travel. I have to bring my ideas together. My sincerest apologies for arriving late. Yeah. While you think about your question, let me. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, when I made the introduction of your project, Chimurenga, I was telling the audience about the library that you started to work on, and how it's kind of constituting an archive, you know, about the idea of Pan-Africanism and how this subject has been dealt by the diaspora and within the continent. So perhaps you could tell us a little more about it, you know, this experience of gathering this library and gathering this material in order to kind of rethink the history of these experiences.
Right. Yeah, perhaps I could, perhaps not. I want to continue to speak about the newspaper because it's present tense for me. It's not an art event or activity. It's where I am constantly. Every other activity departs from it. The second thing we started thinking about once we were traveling back in time was that, okay, if one deconstructs the uses and the form and the history even of newspaper, perhaps the newspaper can then become this kind of vehicle. You can do anything with it. And so we thought, okay, one of our main concern is this idea of curriculum. So we've discussed the newspaper as a producer of time, but it was important to also discuss the newspaper as a producer of knowledge, not only a container of knowledge, not merely a textbook, yeah? And so this is the second challenge we wanted to take. That challenge relates to another crisis. The crisis, in my mind, is a crisis to how do we learn what we know? And this is tied to the conceptual crisis I was describing earlier. How do we learn what we know? There's a phrase that you will hear in many African cities when you travel through them. Thank you. There's a phrase, if you go to Johannesburg and you're taking the bus, you ask for direction in the street, you say, where is Sheikh's Pompey? The person would tell you, Angazi, but I'm sure if you walk 5 kilometers and you turn left, and you know, Angazi, but I'm sure, translates as I do not know, but I'm sure. So here you are in the middle of Sao Paulo trying to get to Shakespeare Pier, and you are late for your talk. And you ask for direction. And this person tells you, I don't know, but I'm sure if you walk 200 meters left, right. I'm like, do you know or don't you know? I'm actually late. I don't have time. This space in which someone articulates an absolute certainty about uncertainty, I think is a space in which most of our knowledge of ourselves and most of our knowledge of the world is contained in, which is that we do not have a language to speak what we know. This is what Angazi, but I'm sure translates as. And so the newspaper was therefore going to be this producer of time, this producer of knowledge, but also a producer of language. One of the languages, one of the languages to produce was, producing knowledge is a form of mapping, as you know. But instead of merely the newspaper being a map, yeah, something that you can read to explicate and locate and situate yourself, it was also going to be a producer of map, and therefore to conceptualize the newspaper as cartography, a producer of maps. There's so many layers to this. I think perhaps once we enter the discussion phase, we'll be able to touch on some more of these points and talk about the library as well. But the library that she was mentioning itself is a result of this ongoing process. So I think I needed to establish why we are producing a library. You only produce a library once you've started producing a newspaper. So thank you very much for your patience and for your time. I hope we get to speak.
Working? Okay. Boa tarde. I want to thank all the organizers for giving. I want to thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity of being here and to participate in this panel. I'm going to address the panel's theme, discussing a recent problem, the suppression actually of two performances by Tania Bruguera in Havana, and give some ideas about the context and about art, silence, and histories. Cuban artist Tania Bruguera was arrested several times in Havana as a result of her intention to reenact her performance Tattling Whisper number 6. Havana version at the public space in Plaza de la Revolución on December 30th, 2014, and by reason of her activities after the police aborted the reenactment and detained Cuban dissidents willing to participate. The work score was to set a simple stage with the PA to allow any person to speak freely during 1 minute. The performance was initially presented at the Wilfredo Lam Center during the 10th Havana Biennial in 2009 and was a historic event in Cuba. For the first time in half a century, a free public tribune was allowed for people to speak their minds. Bruguera thus managed in that occasion to use art's permissive environment to create a space for freedom in a totalitarian context. Art weakness as a minority practice paradoxically empower it to attain something that has remained impossible for social activism in Cuba due to a harsh repression. It was a limited action, but one with major symbolic impact, one that incited and helped people to overcome their fear, and a clear demonstration of Cubans' feelings and opinions. Although this 2009 performance was authorized by the biennial organizers, the results, people crying for freedom and democracy, seem to have surpassed these officials' miscalculations about self-censorship's strength to curb people to freely express. Next day, the Biennial Organization Committee issued a statement condemning the performance in very harsh terms, while Bruguera was admonished, closing a semantic circle that completed the work's message. Although many censorship events have happened, since the 1980s, the Cuban government has been tolerant to some degree of social and political criticism in the reduced milieu of the arts, while keeping absolute control over the media and street demonstration. Many Cuban artists have been very critical to the political situation in Cuba, but they have kept no links with the organized opposition. That is, the Pacific activists, bloggers, etc., who receive harsh treatment and are officially labeled as dissidents. A term that, strictly speaking, can be also applied to many critical artists, writers, playwrights, musicians, and filmmakers. The problem with Bruguera's performances in Cuba is that they break these boundaries and mix things up. Bruguera has stated that, quote, art is a safe platform from which to have a dialogue about political ideas and even try new political structures. Something that must be considered disposable, a means for other things, a protection layer, unquote. Nevertheless, she has also emphasized that artists' privileged position can only exist if bearers of real power allow it for their own reasons. Testing these limits is a sort of arm wrestling that political art has to undertake against established real and symbolic power. And Bruguera's art often tries out illegal border crossings across customary definitions, expectations, and authoritative rules. In Cuba's repressive context, it would have been naive to think that Cuban authorities would allow to repeat Tattling Whisper number 6 in a public space, and even more in one with such symbolic political connotations as the Plaza de la Revolución, the Revolution Square, as Tania tried to perform. The point about Bruguera reenacting the performance was less about the hope of creating a space for free expression, and much more to defy the repression of freedom of expression in situ by an artivistic gesture. This challenge was good both for art and for politics in Cuba. It succeeded in creating awareness about the situation and was very healthy within the current art scene, immersed in wild commercialism focused on selling out works to American collectors. The event also showed, both symbolically and in reality, that the Cuba-USA detente will not mean progress in human rights in the island, at least not in the short term. There have been some scholastic reflections in the web and through emails about Bruguera's actions being art or not, or being an accomplished art piece or not, as in 3 open emails sent by artist Lázaro Saavedra, who articulated the opinion of many Cuban artists against Bruguera's performance. It would be fruitful to introduce in these considerations Guy Debord's radical notion of suppression and realization of art as 2 inseparable conditions for surpassing it. Bruguera considers that the political artist's position is problematic by definition. It is one of dissatisfaction because of only being able to be between art and politics. From its inception, her art has tried to go beyond representation towards concrete social action. An early example was Memory of the Post-War in 1993, an independent cultural newspaper published by the artists in Cuba until it was confiscated and banned by the authorities. Her behavior art school, implemented in Havana from 2002 to 2009, was a foremost and fruitful effort for art education in Cuba that fostered a new generation of artists at a critical moment. A most recent example is the Migrant People Party founded by Bruguera in Mexico City in 2010. Are these works art? Do they just use art for other purposes? Do they expand art's reach and boundaries? Are these discussions pertinent? Perhaps the designation and notion of artivism is the best way to name these works and to describe their hybrid character in the very term. Many artists work today in this direction, and also sometimes artworks escape away into the social following their own artistic processes, even if this was not its original aim. And vice versa, as we can see in some political actions that incorporate aesthetic, theatrical, and symbolic means to increase their force. Anyhow, it is telling that far away from scholarly definitions, the Cuban regime is avoiding the word artist to refer to Bruguera. And an official Cuban blog published an article titled, Tania Bruguera, From Visual Artist to Provocative Mercenary. If Tattling Whisper number 6 intended reenactment was art, if it was art, Cuban authorities reacted by an extreme practice of art criticism, which, on the other hand, and as it has happened before, closed Bruguera's artwork semantic circle by being an active element for the piece to create its message. Saavedra has even said, ironically, that, quote, the provocateur artist put the idea and the state security made the work. Bruguera's passport and her laptop computer were held after the work was aborted or completed by the police co-author, while she was arraigned by a prosecutor for allegedly committing 3 felonies: incitement to public disorder, resistance to police, and incitement to break the law, from which she could receive a jail sentence. Bruguera was finally acquitted and the charges against her suspended because of being an internationally well-known artist, due also to the international media impact of her case and as a result of international solidarity. For almost 6 months, she endured frequent interrogation and threats by a lieutenant colonel of the Interior Ministry, a woman, and other agents, and has been menaced by police. On May 20th, during the 12th Havana Biennial's opening week, Bruguera started the first session of the foundational process of the Hannah Arendt International Institute of Artivism. The sessions took place at Bruguera's home in Havana, located in a grassroots neighborhood, in Old Havana specifically, but which is just 1 block to the National Museum. It's a very particular location. Well, this is people waiting for the performance in the Plaza de la Revolución in Havana, and it was repressed by the police. The artist was arrested, and many dissidents who planning to go were stopped by the police and put detained, stopped, and kept for 20 hours before releasing them. For the Institute of Artivism's first session, she wide opened the doors to the street as a storefront, like in her memorable 1997 performance, The Burden of Guilt, also an independent event during the 6th Havana Biennial. Through an email release and flyers, the artist announced that Hannah Arendt's 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, would be read uninterruptedly until completion, and then a public action would take place. Her home stayed open all the 24 hours, and anyone was welcome to participate in the reading and subsequent discussions. Before the opening, the police warned her that they would not allow her to perform in the street. Bruguera, in a clever move, managed to obtain a license as a private teacher. So it was perfectly legal for her to do the reading indoors. So here she's reading Arendt's book. The performance began as announced, a loudspeaker pointing out to the street through the open door. However, loud noise produced by workers who timely began to drill the street in front of the house as part of works being undertaken in the neighborhood went over the loudspeaker. Yet, as Louis Kamnitzer has put it, I quote Kamnitzer, the power of the piece wasn't derived from the content of the text, but rather from the choice of book, the setting, and the concentrated endurance of those involved in the marathon. A philosophical text difficult to hear and probably exceeding anyone's conceivable attention span under the circumstances was considered to be sufficiently threatening to the government that steps were taken to interfere with the performance. What they didn't understand is that drilling made no difference. With or without the drilling noise, the piece was untouchable. Tania had identified a crack in the wall of official regulations, and the authorities revealed themselves as one step short of the moral equivalent of book burners. So they create this beautiful Richard Long in front of Bruguera's home in Old Havana. Among the readers were Bruguera's friends, a few artists and curators who were visiting the biennial, members of the Ladies in White, who are the wives of Cuban prisoners of consciousness and of conscience, and as far as I know, only a couple of people from the Cuban art world. The number of visitors was much bigger, but still a lack of response prevailed in a city bursting of art events. Such indifference was eloquent when Bruguera was stopped by undercover police agents from entering the National Museum on May 23rd for her friend painter Tomás Sanchez's opening, who invited her to attend. The gatekeepers claimed that the museum had the right of admission. Here it says she's outside the museum entrance. And paradoxically, a work by the artist was at the exhibition as part of the museum's permanent collection. This incident was witnessed by artists and visitors, and very few reactions happened at the spot or later on. All this is shameful for the institution and for the art world. Regardless of the opinion that each one can have about Bruguera's art and politics, she's a serious artist being harassed and in critical danger just for advocating freedom of expression, something crucial for art, crucial for all of us. We all can be Tania. Solidarity against censorship and repression is a general responsibility for intellectuals that should prevail beyond their differences and agendas, something that almost did not have effect during the Havana Biennial's incidents. On Saturday afternoon, after Arendt's reading was completed, Bruguera walked out of her home to the street, holding a white dove in one hand and Arendt's book in the other, accompanied by a few friends and biennial visitors. She went out despite the menacing presence of rough-looking, sturdy men all over the street. Bruguera walked to the right toward the first intersection. Followed by the group, and then, after we covered some 30 meters, another performance took place. As in a Hollywood thriller, two cars appeared, the first one stopping in front of Bruguera. Her two interrogators went off the vehicle swiftly, the lieutenant colonel wearing her uniform, all others undercover as the tough guys who surrounded the group. They confronted the Bruguera in a dramatic way, the colonel shouting to her. They told her that she could not continue and that they would take her to her mother's house, which is in a distant neighborhood. The artist discussed with them. It was a moving and meaningful image to witness the tall, corpulent woman in uniform and wearing sunglasses, and the other interrogator confronting the artist holding the white dove and the book in her hands. The whole scene looked like a straightforward allegory. Bruguera told me later that she thought to give the book to the police in a symbolic gesture, but then she decided that it would be better to free the dove, which she casted into the air. The bird flew free, but nervous and disoriented as it was, hit the house facade and went down to the pavement, where it remained confused. I think Then Bruguera threw up the book very strongly. here you can see the book in the air, and she's throwing it. It happened to hit the facade too in a very violent way, producing a loud, impressive sound. Even if the place was crowded, a general silence prevailed in the street. It was as if that sound of the book's blow against the wall would have compressed in one single bang all the volume's content, summarizing the 100 hours reading of the book that had just been performed. While this occurred, a group of women and men, many of them senior persons, arrived almost in line, surrounding us and preventing our group to take photos and videos. And this is the reason why there is little visual material documenting the event. Bruguera finally entered the car, and the vehicles abandoned. Abandoned the scene, driven in reverse. When this came about, in a synchronized way, the group of civilians began to shout Cold War days political slogan from the political slogans, while Bruguera's neighbors remained silent. This organized action is called in Cuba a repudiation act, and have been staged over the years to intimidate dissidents and even people just looking to leave the country. The artist was drove around and finally left at her mother's, where she spent the night. Next day, she told me on the phone that more than 50 dissidents were arrested by the police while leaving their homes to participate in the performance culmination, and were released after a few hours. Okay, but why all this excess only to stop a solitary artist? Of course, it was done to send the message that no opposition, not even an artistic one, will be tolerated in Cuba. Yet, such vast, well-planned and coordinated police operation was also a symptom of fear and weakness. It shows that in situations where dissent is crushed by established powers, art recovers its sharpest critical edge, reloads its truly subversive competence. Was Bruguera's performance aborted by the police raid? I think that I had the privilege of witnessing a unique case in art history, a street performance that was completed in response to its very repression. We don't know what the artist was actually planning to execute in the street. What she actually did with the dove and the book was an improvised reaction that resulted in a most impressive performance, one that epitomized the confrontation between freedom and repression, knowledge and power, the individual subject and the state, in a symbolic action that went beyond representation to take place in harsh reality, and that was an immediate result of it. The performance's artistic actions were generated by the very repression it experienced. Once the biennial's inaugural week ended, Bruguera was bruised when temporarily arrested again by the police for attending the Ladies in White March following her ongoing research for a bill on rights to free speech that she plans to propose in Cuba. As a participant at Tattling Whisper number 6 in 2009 exclaimed at the podium, "Let us wish that someday freedom of speech in Cuba will not have to be a performance." Thank you.
Obrigada, Gerardo. Thank you very much, you all. I'll go quickly open to questions. I just would like to briefly comment on your words, because actually we have seen such a diversity of artworks presented here. You know, starting with Cristiano, Dor, and then Karol, Ntone in a way, and Tânia Brugueira's work. And it's kind of hard to think of a transversal line between these practices. But what really struck me was the idea of these practitioners are kind of expanding our methodology. So when you ask, is this art, activism, or you kind of problematize this question, in a way you are opening our perceptions that these works kind of they operate within disciplinary borders. So it's very interesting that Karol works with archives, and it kind of opens the methodologies, or make historians think about their methodologies and how they are dealing with oral history and how they are dealing with archives. And also when Ntone makes this narrative about the 2008 experience and this crisis, and when you kind of state in a very strong way, well, I want to address the present, it also made me think that we question the past from the present. So it's really interesting that you kind of, stay with this idea and really want to address the present in order to look back to the past. And what Tânia is doing is exactly this, opening while she is kind of stressing and this characteristic of Cuban society, of this restriction of speech, and she's doing this in a very radical way through performance. She's kind of showing that through the present there is a restriction of discourse regarding the past as well. So, in the historical experience of the Cuban state. So, I think these were my brief comments. I think it would be interesting also if Ntone could show some images of the Chimurenga project that he brought briefly, and then we would open to the questions of the audience.
Yeah. Oh, right. Great. Let's see what we have here. All right. I was speaking about the newspaper's cartography. I'm not going to resume that entire point, but I thought it was useful to show the value of cartography in this rhetorically poor environment I'm describing, where we have no language, because all the representation, all the images that are produced about our world, about our continent, from the very first map that we've used to the map that you use at school, that you are taught to. For instance, growing up in Cameroon, they tell you this is Cameroon, and that shape is indelible in your mind. So we started producing. I became obsessed. Well, obsessed is an exaggeration, but I became interested in the question of what will this map look like if they were produced by Africans themselves and for their own benefit, for their own uses. So this is an example of a map of conflicts going on across the continent. That is kind of war, essentially. And you will see that there are no countries per se, there are no borders per se, because our experience of how these conflicts take place, how they regionalize themselves, how the individual element, personal elements, narrative, biographies get involved in generating and sustaining them. The UN are just unable to produce this map, right? And so we have to do it for them and for ourselves. So that's one example. but I also spoke about the newspaper as a producer of knowledge and language, and this is an example of language, not necessarily with capital L, but with small l, as in languages. We often publish the newspaper in language that none of the editorial members speak. So this is an edition that we produced in German. There might be examples of, okay, sorry, I'm just continuing, but comics, the most advanced, in my opinion, the most advanced form of writing on the continent currently, and this is completely subjective, everything I've said today is completely subjective, is comics writing. Okay, there's something about the cosmological space we occupy, this kind of idea of things being, everything being multiple, everything being mutating, and everything being mobile. This is kind of the cosmological space I live in. You know, a cat is also a tree, is also a human, who can be alive or dead. Comics, as a form of writing, kind of have this expansive space we're interested, so we produce a lot of writing through comics form. And this is another newspaper edition we just produced in Arabic. Again, none of us in the editorial team speak Arabic. There are a few more examples of these maps that we're continuously producing to generate knowledge about ourselves, including secret countries and so forth. I wanted to share that with you in case you haven't come across the publication itself. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Alguém gostaria de colocar uma questão?
Don't be shy.
Não, só queria pedir para a Sabrina falar um pouco do trabalho do Cristiano e do Dorgues, que foram apresentados no início, num contexto mais da mesa. Acho que seria legal falar um pouco.
Sim, o trabalho do... Acho que faltou mesmo essa introdução. O trabalho do Cristiano lida com duas instâncias totalmente opostas de algumas narrativas nacionais. Uma delas seria a superquadra, né, o espaço das superquadras, e a figura do Saci na literatura. E aí, como ele vai com ironia, enfim, repensando e desconstruindo, ou colocando essas duas narrativas inusitadamente em contato. Assim, isso é o que eu posso falar sobre o trabalho do Cristiano, que, enfim, é um trabalho com humor, de certa forma, muito sarcástico. E o trabalho do Dor, que se chama Bypass, e que trata das rotas percorridas por trabalhadores palestinos diariamente em busca de trabalho em Jerusalém. Então, como ele vai retratando e vai percorrendo junto com essas pessoas esses caminhos, mas sem deixar vestígios da presença humana, né? Sem representar a presença humana, mas sim os traços e os rastros dessa jornada diária. Acho que é isso. Mas alguém gostaria de colocar mais uma pergunta?
Oi, boa tarde. Na verdade, eu gostaria um pouco de um comentário de vocês. Vocês três apresentaram suas pesquisas e trabalhos que partem de perspectivas de resistência, seja na questão da cultura queer, ou de uma situação de um país que viveu uma grande e ainda vive questões, né, de colonização racial, ou uma questão da ditadura. mas a gente tem tanto a arte quanto a comunicação e essas estruturas, né, essas plataformas que são impressas ou performáticas para, de alguma maneira, questionar ou se contrapor. Eu queria que vocês comentassem um pouco se existem estratégias que sejam semelhantes, apesar de que talvez o que vocês estejam se colocando sejam diferentes. A gente tem 3 temáticas bem diferentes: a ditadura militar na América Latina, a situação dos países africanos e a questão da sexualidade, de identidades. Existem algo em comum nessas estratégias de resistência e reflexão? Quais seriam as diferenças ou similaridades que vocês percebem na maneira com que esses artistas ou vocês próprios têm se contraposto a essa questão?
Well, thank you for the question. For me, I think it's very important to clarify, and I think this departure from a publication we call Chimurenga initially, and that we define as struggle, I think for me, I think it's very important to clarify that we don't necessarily consider ourselves to be resisting something. We are not putting ourselves and our production in opposition to anything. I think that we are very committed to working with things. As a matter of fact, to working with everything. That doesn't mean that we don't have particular positions and so forth, but the idea of an oppositional, stance in the context I live in makes absolutely no sense any longer. It's just like a production of a performance of politics as opposed to actual politics. The reason we publish a newspaper, the reason we have a library, the reason we have a radio station, is because we are trying to engage very seriously with institutions. We are trying to engage with the apparatus itself of power, as opposed to running away to hide and say, oh, we are so oppressed. No, I'm not oppressed at all. It doesn't mean I live in a free society or a good one, but I'm not coming here as a representation of an oppressed person. I thought it was important that I signal this.
Well, I think that what I see in common is precisely the desire to go beyond representation and beyond the reduced art field, in order to try to create practices that you could call art or literature or journalism or activism, but that they are looking, they keep certain symbolic aspects, and so some tools which are close to art and literature, but they are trying to do something more direct and trying to put the finger on a nerve and on something that is needed in very different contexts. And so, and that's what is very interesting to me as a curator, because I feel that the art world has been is leaning very much toward the new phenomenon of the art fair, which is taking over and reducing other fields, other possibilities for art to work in a more socially oriented way. I'm not against the art fair. I'm not against the galleries. I think that here in Brazil, we have is an example of good galleries, of serious galleries, the best in Latin America, I would say, that they really play a fruitful role for the arts. But I think that this is scary, how much the commercial aspect of art is taking over other practices, you know, around the world. So as a curator, I am more interested about these experiences. Well, Ana Pato is here, who was a curator for the Bahia Biennial, and I had the privilege of going there, and I was very impressed because they were proposing a different model for the biennial, a model that was reacting to the very specific context in the Nordeste, and at the same time it was international, and it was, let's say, sophisticated in artistic terms, and they were dealing with local issues, but at the same time they were at the avant-garde of creating new models for the presentation of art. They work with archives. There was never a final list of artists participating in the Bahia Biennial. I mean, this is an example of experiments in which I am interested, and I think I've been very attracted by what you two guys have been doing, you know, in your own context, as well as this very harsh experience by Tania Bruguera in Havana.
So yeah, I agree with you, and I can just refer to what you said, that I also feel that maybe, as I was trying to explain, there was some time when I was more active in a political or activistic way, but now when the situation is more diverse, and in Poland there are real activists of the political influence, I'm trying to not escape totally from the art world, rather using the system on my terms, like I was showing with bringing Ryszard Kisiel to New York, or being here and criticizing the new government which was elected, because I think from the artist position we could work on a different fields, also like education, but through the books, through the conferences, which is not visible now, but it will come from the unexpected directions, I think, and I found it this more interesting also for me as an art practice, because if it will be not between those two, then I will be pretending that I'm a politician or activist, and why still staying in the art world. So I agree that it's a different position, and maybe for that time for me. And also I agree what Sabrina said, that this multidisciplinary kind of activity, it's kind of common, that people had to be prepared that art, it's not what they expect. It could be mixed with other tools. For example, that's why I started to run magazine just after I graduated as a painter, to have it like 1,000 copies instead of, you know, paintings on the walls or something which will be more limited. And the same with the films. I'm trying to escape from the galleries to the film festivals or to the TV to influence people. That's why with this project I made the documentary quite proper, not so much experimental, so more people could see it, and then that way you can skip some rules. Yeah.
And also I'd like to comment on something that we were discussing prior to the debate, that you mentioned that you were in a symposium along with academics, and how, well, sometimes academics question the rigor, do we say that? The rigor of artists. So in a way that they put into question the methodologies that artists use to deal with the past. But on the other hand, they are expanding the way we deal with sources and the way we deal with materials and procedures and the methodologies themselves. So, of course, there is a clash of disciplines, you know, or clash of modes of knowledge production. But, you know, if these disciplinary boundaries are willing to open, I think a lot of dialogues can be created. And I think that, for instance, I am a historian. I think that historians can kind of change or expand the way they deal with sources. because this is what artists are doing, you know, and this is why it's also so interesting. And this doesn't mean that this kind of work doesn't have rigor. It's not rigorous. It depends on the person or the researcher who is doing. Alguém mais gostaria de colocar uma pergunta?
Minha pergunta é para o Karol. Eu vou fazer em português. I will do in português. Você mencionou bem de passagem que existe uma diferença entre o que o movimento LGBT, entre as pautas atuais, não sei se eu entendi bem, mas entre as pautas atuais do movimento LGBT e o seu interesse, digamos, em termos de... enfim, o seu interesse nesse universo e no resgate desses arquivos com os quais você trabalha. Eu queria te pedir para falar um pouco mais sobre essas diferenças.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I mentioned briefly, to be understood, it's like as I said, in 2005 I made the first openly gay exhibition in my country and the first real gay novel come out, so everything, my country is very Catholic, so it's also very homophobic, and this is the context that, like, the issue of gay issue is still hot in the politics conversation, it's manipulated. So the activists they're under pressure that they want to build a positive image of the gay and lesbian men, but mostly the guys are doing this. So I was always, as an artist, interested in kind of avant-garde and something which is queer in the wider perspective than just gay rights. And it happened that my magazine and my activity started a bit earlier than the gay mainstream come out in Poland. So what I was criticizing, in a way, from queer perspective, was more addressed to the West, or kind of, it was like an avant-garde without any enemy or something to criticize. And I posed the question if we should pass this way, like in the West or United States or in Western Europe, repeat all these things from 60s, and if the stone wall it's the crucial point for us, or we could build something more alternative from different perspectives. But at the end it happened that they were afraid that my work is too sexually explicit, that it refers to the words like faggots or queers in Polish, which are bad, not nice words, and they wanted to rather present young, nice guys, handsome gays who are lawyers and talk about pink money. So, and it's happening in most of the countries from the regions, from what I see. And if you have only a few people come out and in the media, like you have one actor, two politicians, like more activists at that time, me and somebody else, then it's also a question of representation. If you're saying something explicitly sexual or provocative, you know, I always have to say I'm not the voice of the whole community, and that was a really big problem. And also, in 2010 we have the Europride in Warsaw, and all the parties were for gays, were very expensive, and all the panels were about the business. There were no any culture events almost. So that was the moment when we started with my friends to do the queer festival, like do-it-yourself queer festival, and kind of in an ironic way, but we posed the question if we want to have a rainbow or something which will be more ours, let's say. That's why our festival, everything is black and white, hand draws, and no rainbow, no pink color, as a kind of statement. So the first mainstream magazine came out last year in Poland, and it's called Pride. You can buy it everywhere, and they started to discuss the queer issues from introducing the work of Tom of Finland. So it's a completely different way of thinking and the work. So it's not like we are fighting, but there is a totally different position. And also, it's not such a hardcore situation like in Russia when you can be beaten and it's by the law that you are kind of under oppression. So in Poland, it's something just between. Maybe it will change when I get back from Brazil after what is happening now, from what I saw from my Facebook, my friends in Poland now. But yeah, to finish, it's just this kind of weird position for me as an artist also.
Ok, eu acho que ninguém tem mais nenhuma questão. A gente pode finalizar a mesa. Vocês gostariam de colocar alguma questão entre si? Ou would you like to make any more questions among you guys? Or no? Okay, thank you so much for your presence. And thank you so much for coming to the festival. Obrigada a todos e obrigada pela presença.
Agora tá. Bom, agradecer só, dizer que é um prazer e uma honra para o Vídeo Brasil finalizar o nosso seminário com convidados tão prestigiosos. Agradecer a Sabrina pelo excelente seminário também. E aí gostaria de convidá-los, para quem não viu ainda as exposições do festival, tem 2 exposições aqui no Sesc Pompeia, uma na área de convivências e um no Galpão. Tem uma terceira exposição no Galpão do Vídeo Brasil, são as 3 exposições principais, corpo principal do festival, e uma exposição ainda paralela no Paço das Artes. A programação do festival continua até o dia 6 de dezembro. Eu convido vocês a consultarem essa programação, que está mais atualizada e completa na agenda do site do festival, 19festival.com, ou ainda nessa programação impressa que tem saindo aqui. E, mais precisamente, hoje, agora, às 4h30, aqui no teatro, a gente dá início aos programas de filme do festival, com obras que integram essa edição do festival. São 3 programas de obras selecionadas e um programa de filmes de um artista convidado, o português Gabriel Abrantes. Está super interessante, fica desde as 4h30 até quase 10 da noite com filmes. Essa programação toda quinta-feira aqui no Teatro do Sesc Pompeia e às terças-feiras no Galpão do Vídeo Brasil. E ainda só dizer que essa revista que o Karol edita, ele deixou 2 números com a gente na sala de leituras do Galpão VB. Então, se vocês quiserem ver esse conteúdo também com mais calma, vocês estão convidados a ver isso por lá. Obrigada, gente.